across America. Live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to spend some time today in the first hour really just talking about your Christian life and the Christian walk. And we'll get into some things which I think you'll find very helpful. Next hour, we're going to get back into some of the things happening both politically, but also because of a number of articles that have surfaced. Look a little bit more at this idea of emotional health and how to think about that from a biblical point of view. And I think you will appreciate those conversations, certainly. But if you've ever struggled with the need for certainty, maybe dealt with the issue of doubt, of course, I'll hold up some of the booklets we have on a biblical view on the arguments for God, or a biblical view on biblical reliability, biblical view on God and science, to mention just a few that I just pulled off of our stack of things that we've addressed in the past. There is really a need as we start walking through the Christian life to know how to begin to focus on our faith, answer some of the very vexing questions that sometimes surface in the 21st century, and to really begin to understand more about who Jesus is and how we should live as Christians. So I think you're going to find this book very helpful. It is entitled The Way Ahead, Walking Together in Faith Through the Spiritual Trials of Our Time. I know many of you, interestingly enough, have a small group, and at the end of every chapter, first are some devotional thoughts, and then there is a section for a small group discussion. So it is really sort of made for you if you want to go through it individually, or if you want to go through it with a group. That is the case. The book's been out for a couple of months. You might have some difficulty finding it in your local bookstore. If you do, great. But if you don't, we do have a link because it's been out since February, about 300 pages of great material. It is written by Dr. Sean Cortopassi. He is the author of this book, of course, and has served 16 years in federal service, and also as an individual that has a doctorate in theology from Andersonville Theological Seminary, 2 master's degrees, and in some respects is bivocational, and I think that's another strength of this as well. An individual that is a fellow traveler, and so Sean, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
It's great to be here, sir.
You know, in the few times when I've been invited to speak at a seminary, or even for a while where I've been a guest lecturer, I sometimes suggest that for pastors going out into the world, they might do themselves a favor if they were to get a secular job, either as they are in the pastorate or even before so, because in some respects it helps them maybe relate more to the congregation. Individuals that have grown up, for example, were homeschooled, then went to a Christian school, went to seminary, and go into the pastorate, probably don't have some of that experience. And you, early on in the book, talk about this bivocational situation that you're in, and that has been fruitful for you in even writing this book.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know what? The Apostle Paul was a tent maker, so I have to put that out there. But yeah, I mean, there is something to be said about making time for ministry and making time for professional career as well. Balancing both of those can be a challenge, no doubt about that. But it's about integrating, professional responsibility and ministry, and in my case, somehow finding time to write this book that we're discussing today.
Well, again, thank you for your service, but also let's see if we can get into this, because you begin us really talking about the fact that we're talking about the Christian walk, and you talk about this idea of unlocking, of finding balance, of really trying to have a sense, and maybe if you could set forth for us how all of this comes together, because in some respects, there's kind of a natural flow to the way in which your book unfolds.
Yes, it's 21 total chapters broken out into 5 sections. I did my best to put in a lot of research to ensure not only the scriptures were properly referenced, but also additional sort of best things that I could find that really help with the argument that basically Christ is the center. we need to follow a scripture-based life and live a practical life and stay rooted in order to stay on the path.
And again, we're going to be talking about, of course, who Christ is. Christology is the theological word that we use. But let's talk about this idea of walking together in faith, because early on, it gets back to one of the things I said just a minute ago, dealing with uncertainty, facing doubt and ambiguity. Now, the good news is, as I just held up some of our books on apologetics, tomorrow we're going to be doing an interview on archaeology. It would, by the way, would be the third book on archaeology that has come out this year, which shows you that we're in sort of almost this golden age of apologetics, this golden age of archaeology, where there's so much evidence for our Christian faith, but that still doesn't mean that you aren't going to face doubt and uncertainty as you go into, in your case, the workaday world, and you're surrounded by a lot of people that aren't members of your church.
Absolutely. Most Christians, they're not suffering because they don't have a passion for the truth. They struggle because, life is so fast, overscheduled, nonstop screens, constant noise. And so the current way of life makes it hard what we need to do as Christians is to slow down, silence the mind, really listen and reflect on God's teachings and commands as seen in the scriptures.
The chapter is on the idea of walking together in faith. And let's, if we can, maybe get your thoughts about faith itself, because you talk about the significance of faith and how perseverance can make an impact. You talk about how, in some respects, faith is key to, in many cases, dealing with the maybe doubts, uncertainty that you might have. So in some respects, don't we have some definitions of faith, for example, in the book of Hebrews and other places? How would you address this issue of faith, since really what we're talking about today is walking together in faith?
Yeah. Well, obviously faith must lead to action. It's not something you should keep private. It's something that you share within yourself, your family, your community. But let me just kind of give you all my perspective. For me, as somebody who's tries to be a scholar as well as minister and public servant, I believe for me to build faith, it had to be engaging both the mind and the heart,
right?
Not just one or the other. So for me, it's reflection, contemplation, and don't just react. Really think about what you're taking in when you read the scriptures and you read about the cornerstone, which is Christ.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk about some of those transformative issues, choosing Christ, the Bible as the foundation of faith and truth, some things that we talked about the other day with George Barna, which reminded us that the younger you are, the less likely you are maybe to not necessarily hold to some of those issues, and these are the cornerstones of our Christian faith. So we're going to kind of do, if you will, almost Sunday School 101, but I'm beginning to recognize how important that is in this modern day world. And then we'll just kind of get into what does it mean to really believe in Jesus Christ? What is this idea of Christology, and how should that really affect the way in which we walk through faith? That's our conversation. We'll take a break, be back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Psychologist and author Jonathan Haidt has been researching the influences on teenagers and young adults. Several years ago, we interviewed him on his book, The Coddling of the American Mind. More recently, he's been known for his book, The Anxious Generation. He was recently asked on a podcast, who makes better parents, left-wingers or right-wingers? At first, he pointed to data that showed a slight gap where conservatives are a little happier than liberals. He added it isn't clear whether that is due to parenting or some other factor. However, he then pointed to research he did for his book. The gap between left and right becomes a chasm after 2012. As we discussed on previous commentaries, the date 2012 coincides with the mass adoption of the iPhone and social media apps. He says the bottom line is that when kids are rooted in communities, they don't get washed out to sea by the phone-based childhood living in the virtual world. So over and over again, when we look at the left, right, or whether we look at religion, what we find is that secular kids and the liberal kids who get washed out to sea get really depressed after 2012, and a much less effect on conservative and religious kids because I think they're more rooted. The conclusion shouldn't be controversial. We know from numerous studies that children do best in a loving home with a father and a mother. They do best when children don't spend lots of time online. They do best when they're rooted in a community and have social interactions, such as we find in church. We talked about the comments by Jonathan Haidt on my radio program and concluded that more and more research is confirming what the Bible has taught for millennia. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again as we talk about the book, The Way Ahead, Walking Together in Faith Through the Spiritual Trials of Our Time. Dr. Sean Cortopassi is with us, and in some respects going to turn this into, I guess, Sunday School 101, Bible School first year. It reminds me back in 1961, Vince Lombardi comes into a room of Green Bay Packer veterans, holds up a football and said, "Gentlemen, this is a football." Now, he wasn't trying to insult their intelligence. He was saying, let's get back to the fundamentals. Sean, in some respects, that's the case because some of the middle chapters in your book get into the idea that we need to choose Christ. We need to understand what this issue of Christology is. You even go into such things as the hypostatic union. For just a few minutes, let's see if we can get the fundamentals right, because really, if I understand your book carefully, if you don't get your view of Jesus Christ right, and you don't understand what it means to be a follower of Jesus, then all the other things you're talking about in the book don't work out. And so in some respects, that's key, isn't it?
That's absolutely key. And I think there's, for me, and why I wrote this book, there's nothing more important than that. I'd like to share a quick reason to why. I had met with a kind of a mentor of mine that was a Baptist, and he said, "Hey, I think Christ's good man, good teacher, but if you ask me, was he divine? Yeah, not so much." And I remember thinking, I was taken aback. I said, "Oh, how can that be?" And so I really thought, okay, let's take a step back. Let's really think, who is Christ? And the hypostatic union, that sounds very scientific, but it's really comes down to two things. Christ was fully man, and he was divine. And so why is that so important? Why can't he just be God and not human? Well, if he wasn't human, then he couldn't have understood what it meant to be, what it means to live. What it means to live day to day, and the sacrifice that he made for us. So that's why I keep I risk sounding like a broken record in the book a little bit. I have to admit, but I think it's so important really dig into the hypostatic union and why that's so important.
Yeah. Well, I think
Yeah.
of in Hebrews, for example, we are told that we do not have a high priest who is unable to emphasize or empathize, I should say, with our weaknesses, but we have someone who was tempted in every way just as we are. So in some respects, of course, it also gets into not only understanding who we are, also paying the penalty for our sin. And this, I think, Sean, is a big issue because what you see with a lot of the surveys, and whether it's George Barna or Lifeway, whether it's some of the surveys that have been done from the DSS, Pro Ministries, including our own work here, even in our booklet on the next generation, what we find is a lot of young people say, well, this isn't that important. It's kind of like the pastor you were talking to. Well, I believe that he's a great role model. He was a good man. But if he wasn't all the things the Scripture says he was, then many of the key doctrines that we're going to talk about in just a few minutes fall apart, don't they?
100%. That is the goal of those who want to diminish Christianity in any way, and that is to try to pull at that cornerstone. I feel very passionate about that. We must not give an inch on that front. As far as Jesus, yes.
Well, one of the other things I thought I'd pick out is, in some respects, one of the reasons that I think some of the younger generation, but older generation as well, say, well, we really don't know that much about Jesus. That's why you've actually devoted at least one short chapter on why we can trust our Bible. And, of course, I will hold up our booklet on biblical reliability. We're going to, of course, be talking tomorrow about archaeology that validates that as well. And for people that sometimes want to get off of that or maybe begin to compromise on their view of Jesus Christ, well, one of the fallback positions is that, well, maybe we just don't know that much. Maybe these were stories that were passed on from generation to generation, and so there's a lot of myth and legend, and that's simply not true, is it?
Absolutely not. I am a man who has spent my life digging into the facts and really trying to understand what is real, what isn't, what is myth, based on my reading of the apostles and their trustworthiness and the trustworthiness of the Old Testament. I cannot find any fault there. I can't find anything that doesn't reconcile and make perfect sense to me as I read through the Scriptures. We have to trust that the apostles were being truthful because they had no reason to fabricate in any way. They all of them but John got martyred. They paid enormous penalties. And you have to ask, why would they do that? Why would they subject themselves to that if it wasn't entirely true? But that's just the New Testament, right? But when you really start digging into the Old Testament, it all leads to what is going to be fulfilled in the New Testament through the Messiah. And really, it's just an incredible, I get excited about it. Sorry.
That's good. Well, just let me add one more piece, and then we'll take a break, and that is the resurrection, because you point out that, first of all, these disciples would not go out and die a martyr's death if they thought this was something that had been made up or trusting just one eyewitness account, because there were many that were witnesses to the eyewitness, or many were eyewitnesses to the resurrection, and 1 Corinthians 15 takes us there. You have a whole section here about Lee Strobel, we've had on the program, of course, The Case for Christ. You have a mention of some of the other key books that deal with these issues, and in some respects, one other way in which we can certainly know that our faith is set on a firm foundation is when the Apostle Paul wanted to set forth in his letter to the church in Corinth what was the most significant argument for the truthfulness of the message of Jesus Christ. What does he talk about? the resurrection. And it seems to me that that also is one of the reasons why you put that in there, because you wanted people to, in the devotional section and even in the small group discussions, spend some time talking about the significance of the resurrection.
Absolutely. Without the resurrection, that is what gives Christianity, I guess you could say, it makes it real. It makes it more than a story. Knowing that Christ is living, he's still watching over us, cares about us, seeks to be united with us. Yeah, absolutely.
And again, I just mentioned in passing, but let's talk about that for a second before we take a break. We have the devotional thoughts at the end of each chapter, usually a couple, and then you have small group discussion. So the way you've written this, individuals can read through it, but I also think that people that are involved in teaching a small group or a Bible study could use this as well, and that's how you intended it, isn't it?
Yes, sir. I worked very hard with Redemption Press to try to create the best questions I could after reading each chapter, which some are easier than others, I'll be honest. But the devotional thoughts and the study questions are meant to really bring it in and to really, take it another step further and really contextualize what material was covered.
Let me just mention the book is entitled The Way Ahead, Walking Together in Faith Through the Spiritual Trials of Our Time. We've just very quickly, in a superficial way in some ways, looked at the first two sections, the process of faith, connecting with God. We come back, though, I want to focus on relating to the world around us and the Christian life, and then there's some final conclusions. Again, 21 different chapters put in 5 sections, although most of them are in the first 4 sections, and some very good and useful material, the kind of thing that would help you if you're a young Christian wanting to grow. Certainly a great resource if you would want to actually delve a little bit deeper, especially with the discussion questions, and something that you certainly could use if you are teaching a small group Bible study. So you might want to check it out. We're going to take a break, and we have all the information necessary for you to contact him because we have his website there as well. And also we have, of course, at least a link for the book in case you would like to get it in Kindle or paperback, and might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we have information at our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again as we continue our conversation with Dr. Sean Cortopassi. And if you'd like to know more about him, you don't have to even know how to spell his last name because we have a link on our website at pointofview.net. Just click on that button that says See More. You will see that there is all sorts of great information about this book. If you'd want to contact him, ask a question, have him come speak, or maybe even just interact a little bit more on some of the things he's published, it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. And Scott, now we get into, in some respects, the other half of your book, which is the so what question. Now that I certainly maybe have good theology, I'm understanding what that means, then you have a section on relating to the world around us. And the first thing you bring us to is something we talked about at the opening, the importance of being spiritually alert in a confused world. We're getting this, if you will, cacophony of voices, and there is so much in our culture that is forcing us and really trying to conform us to the culture. And so whether you look at the idea that we should not be conformed to this culture, Romans 12:1 and 2, whether you think about the fact that we should not be taken captive by the culture, Colossians 2:8, it does seem to me that that's one of the reasons for your book, isn't it? That you are looking around and seeing individuals that have become very confused in a confusing world.
Absolutely. This was actually my favorite section to write of the 5 because it felt most natural to me. With regards to relating to the world around us, we want to be alert, but not negative, but be alert. Have a servant spirit, but investigate. In today's day and age, work to build bridges and seek Christian unity. Let me just give a quick story that I brought up in the book about the Da Vinci Code.
Okay, yes.
In the book, sorry?
Go ahead.
Yeah, in the Da Vinci Code, it mentions that, Christ had children with Mary Magdalene, and I just think when I was in college at the University of Florida, it was the big book. Everybody wanted to read the Da Vinci Code. And it just brings up nonsense that wasn't historically accurate in any capacity. But it was comfort food, easy to digest, and said, oh yeah, that could be right. Yeah, he's wasn't really, yeah, of course he had kids with Mary Magdalene. It's like, come on, like they're not applying critical thinking skills or any historical fact. They're just digesting it and they're going with it, and it's kind of sad. And I'm hoping that we can turn the page on that. And I do have a theory for why that is happening. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to hear your theory because years ago we, of course, addressed that whole issue of the Da Vinci Code, how to respond to that, and to any other best-selling book, that is out there right now that is embraced by the light, out-of-body experiences, contacting demons, even now with the issue of UFOs. What about that? Because it does seem to me that if we're not careful, we can get caught up in those ideas, or people come to us and say, well, what does the Bible have to say about that? And it seems to me that sometimes that's a great evangelistic opportunity, but we have to be equipped. But why do you think this is happening?
Yeah, right. So, well, to the thought of the why, right? The bigger picture. I think it's postmodernism. This desire to be sort of anything that was like the establishment. And the church, of course, is the establishment. Whether you have a personal relationship with Christ or not, just the church in general, the denominations, seen as the old guard, the old world. But we're new world now. This is the 21st century. So there's a part of that. But to your other question about UFOs and seeking the light and this new age, fads that are going through. It's all a big distraction, unfortunately. And following the way is it's been around for over 2,000 years. It makes sense. It's something that you can rest your eternity on. I just feel bad for those who are, into UFOs and other dangerous, conspiracy theories, other, strange outliers that, you only get one life. You really should focus on, what's important. And that's having a personal relationship with Christ, in my opinion.
Let's talk about another one that is perhaps one of the biggest, and that is your chapter on faith and science. Although I could hold up our booklet that we've done on postmodernism, but I'll hold up the one here on God and science that we just talked about, and even one that we've done on intelligent design. There are a lot of studies that show, especially at the Barna Research Group, which George Barna no longer is head of, but Dave Kitterman and others have actually talked to people that have left the Christian faith, ex-Christians, and asked them why they left. Well, you get some of the standard arguments, just a bunch of hypocrites and this and that. But the argument that shows up most often, I think, especially for kids that are in the science field, is I was told that the Bible and science come together. I was taught the Bible when I was in school and certainly when I was in church, but I went off to college and I saw these great professors who were scientists. Not a one of them was a Christian, and they all said science is what we believe in, and the Bible is faith. And so this whole idea that you talk about in chapter 10 of faith and science is really a key issue, and I think it's important for us to know how to prepare our young people as they go off to college on how to resolve that issue, don't you think?
100%. I wrote in the dedication to my grandfather, who was a professor at Barry University, Barry College at the time, taught me all about, reconciling science and faith as a kid. And so I tried to impart that in the book, especially chapter 10. It is true that there are renowned scientists that don't necessarily believe, they have a secular humanistic viewpoint on life, and they'll say, hey, this doesn't reconcile. But I would say this: if you look at the way DNA is sequenced, it's got to be designed that way. There's no way that it could have. And I see this with a lot of things, with geology, with rocks, all sorts of things in nature. You can tell that it had to have been designed, and that so to the student out there that isn't sure, hey, I want to fit in with my professors, I want to keep quiet, I gotta just toe the line here. You're not going to get. I say toe the line, or don't go with the flow. Stick with what you know is right, and that's scripture.
Yeah, and the good news is that we have probably more available than certainly when I went to college to answer some of those questions. And we have probably more people doing research, apologetics, intelligent design, all sorts of things than ever before. So that really is the good news, is that if you really are looking for answers, if you're serious about finding answers rather than using that as an excuse, that is certainly a good answer to that as well. Let's take a break, but let me mention again, for those of you that just joined us, as we've talked about this particular book, The Way Ahead, we have a whole section at the end of each one of these 21 chapters in which there's some devotional material, there's small group discussions. As a matter of fact, even as we were talking about this area of science, you have a whole section there helping people deal with the evolution creation issue, the whole issue of intelligent design, the question of navigating doubt, the whole issue of faith science inquiry. So these are kinds of things that would be very helpful if you were teaching. But I thought when we come back, we might talk about the fact that we are sending young people, and we are ourselves living in a very divided world. Next hour, we're going to get into that in more detail. Derek Hunter's piece on politicians refusing to talk to the American people, even a very good piece about what is happening right now in terms of therapy, which in some respects is tearing us apart. So So whether it's social media, whether it's counseling, whether it's political divisions, we are really in a very divided world. And sometimes trying to exercise some level of civility is really important. And then there's a chapter on discerning in the midst of disagreement, because you're going to run into disagreement. Friends, neighbors, coworkers, even people in your place of work, whatever, how to sort of navigate that. So some great practical suggestions in the book, The Way Ahead. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again as we talk about the book for a few more minutes, The Way Ahead. Dr. Sean Cortopassi with us. And Sean, if nothing else, your chapter here on faith, dialogue, and unity in a divided world is really kind of the warm-up act for what we'll be talking about in the next hour. We have in the political realm a situation in which politicians are refusing to talk to the American people because they just want to talk to their tribe. By the time we're done, we'll be talking about a new book that is on this whole issue of culture that has been created of therapy, where instead of taking ownership of your own problems, you blame somebody else. And so in some respects, we're seeing all sorts of evidence that we are sending people out every day into the world that is very divided. And I was just even looking at one of the booklets I'll hold up for next hour on our politicized culture, which we wrote 9 years ago. The first part of it is probably pretty dated because it talks about, well, the time the president was George W. Bush. That goes back a few years. But the last section is on the issue of civility. What's a biblical view of civility? And I think that really gets us back to the golden rule. We treat other people as we'd like to be treated. We are willing to engage people in a discussion, in a dialogue. Even if we might disagree with them, we can do so without being disagreeable. And that's really kind of the theme of your chapter, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the whole book, really. The Golden Rule, the Sermon on the Mount. I really love the Gospel of Matthew. It really spoke to me more than the others. But yeah, I mean, live by the fruit of the Spirit. Live for Him. If you do that, right? If you live for Christ. It can be a blessing, and it can help you work with others, even if you disagree with them, because Christ loves them all, loves everyone. We all can't be like Him, but we can do our best to try to be. I think that's the best way to have the civility. But yeah, I mean, obviously try to live righteously, live for purpose, live for Him. Those are sort of the main things. Seek grace, seek truth. Compromise without conviction, but conviction without compassion are things that should be the goal. These are the sorts of things that will help with unity, but not at the expense of truth.
One of the other themes that runs through multiple chapters is discernment, which we talk about so often here, Sean, on the program. Discerning in the midst of disagreement, confronting opposition with biblical clarity, and then the impact of media, truth, deception, and discernment. So, first of all, we've got to recognize that we're not only in the midst of all sorts of words and counterclaims and claims, but some of it is false, some of it is intentionally misleading. Some people are simply not aware of some of those issues, or, of course, even when you're talking with non-Christians, they may not be spiritually discerning. And so it's going to be perhaps an even more significant challenge to live the Christian life in the 21st century. And that's, I would have to say, why we need discernment, isn't it?
Without question. It is getting more and more challenging each year that goes by, between the media, the culture, noise, the constant scrolling, these are real challenges, unprecedented, actually, I think, to live as a Christian in the 21st century. It's about going back to that rock, and it's about don't abandon your faith. I know, this life in the 21st century, it can be exhausting, full of distractions and confusion. But at the end of the day, you just got to pray. You got to go back to the fundamentals, and I'm just hoping that will help people. That's really why I wrote the book. I wrestled. I didn't say I had all the answers, but I wrestled with the questions, and I'm just hoping I can be a companion to folks and help them to work through some of these challenges that we're all facing.
Well, again, you end by talking about this idea of the Christian life and the need to be renewing the mind and reviving the heart. So really, that is why you wrote the book, in an effort to equip individuals to at least understand more of the process of how to begin to walk through the Christian life in faith and how to encounter some of the spiritual trials that I think everybody's going to be facing in this world.
Absolutely. We all have to face it individually. We all have to make that choice. I do recommend for those, to get baptized if you haven't, because it does offer a spiritual rebirth that, first off, it's said in the Gospel of John that we should all be reborn of the Spirit. So I think that's crucial. But it changes somebody. It changes them on the inside. It'll offer spiritual gifts that you probably hadn't, expected, and it really can fill your life with joy and hope more than anything.
Just before I wind down, let me just mention again 21 chapters. At the end of each chapter, a whole section of devotional thoughts, then small group discussion questions. At the end, 25 pages of endnotes. So that give you an idea if some of this is where you say, well, I'd like to check that out. I've never seen that before. You can go and check that, or even a scripture index at the end. So, Sean, if nothing else, I appreciate you writing the book. This was obviously a very significant labor of love for a 300-page book. But more importantly, I appreciate you giving us an hour today. And again, thank you for your service in the federal government.
Yes, sir. And just one other thing, I do also have the audiobook format. My brother's not a big reader, so I said, okay, fine, I'll put it in an audiobook for you. So that's also available, sir.
Well, I might just mention again, we do have a link to your website. It's S. Cortopassi. You don't even have to know how to spell that because we have it linked there. The Cortopassi Theological Leadership has information about you, about the book, about ways in which people can contact you. Of course, we also, in addition to that, also have a link to your Facebook page. Of course, we have information about the book. And as you pointed out, it is available in a variety of different formats, Kindle, paperback, audio, and if that would be of interest to you, that is certainly the case. So, Sean, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, sir.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, let's get into some of that, sort of giving you a preview of what we're going to be talking about. Derek Hunter talks about the fact that we got more and more politicians only want to talk to their tribe. They don't even try to make an argument on the other side. And this tribalism and only believing what I believe, I think is really disturbing. And then we'll get into kind of coming back to this whole idea of what surfaced last week with what I think could be called modern anti-Semitism. Topic that we dealt with Friday. I just got some material from Dr. Merrill Matthews. He has some material where you want to use maybe when we talk about it again on Friday. So we'll get into that. But then we'll spend some time just talking about the issue of emotional health, spiritual health. Why is there a boom in psychiatric medicine and medication? And one of the really good questions, Sounds like a kind of question a Christian would ask, but no, these therapists are saying, is the way in which we do therapy actually tearing people apart, keeping them from actually reaching out to others? And so whether we talk about it in the political realm or the emotional, psychological realm, you're going to see a lot of similarity as we look at different articles. But first, we need to take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday, in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, let's get into some of the issues in the news. And for a few minutes, we're going to kind of talk about a theme, because Derek Hunter has talked about the fact that you are seeing a situation, especially in the Democratic Party, but some of it is seen in the Republican Party as well, in which various individuals running for office, running for re-election, are deciding, we're not even going to talk to people with whom we disagree. We're not even going to go on to various media outlets if we get the sense that we might be getting a difficult question. And first of all, that is certainly not in the spirit of trying to represent all the people of your district, or a president to represent all the people of the country, or a senator representing all the people of the state. And I think in some respects, as I mentioned last hour with our guest, I'll hold up this booklet, which has the title, A Biblical View on a Politicized Culture, which I wrote back in 2017. A few years later, Politics of Hate in 2019. And it just, as you look at these pictures, of course, it's talking about some of the athletes taking a knee. We're going to get to that in just a minute. But I thought it was just striking that Derek Hunter says this is becoming really more of a problem, and we're in the midst of midterm elections. Okay, I recognize a third of the Senate is running, 2/3 are not, so yeah, they could play that game. All the people running for the House of Representatives, 435 members, are going to have to appear before the people. You have, of course, governor's races, you have state Senate, state representative, all sorts of different things, and yet he says one of the things he's noticing, especially among the Democrats, is the unwillingness, and maybe the better word is inability, to speak to anyone who disagrees with them, and that this has become more of a chronic problem. He goes on in another paragraph to say, when's the last time you heard a dissenting voice on MS Now? Used to be MSNBC. Anyone who dares disagree with a progressive narrative on CNN, and I'll say Scott's kind of doing a missionary work there as well, and a few other people, but is usually spoken over, shouted down, cut off for a correction from a host. But I'll at least give CNN at least partial credit, because they will have someone. You see counterpoints all the time on others like Fox and whatever, but nevertheless, Derek Hunter goes on in another paragraph to say, President Joe Biden used to talk about how he wanted to be a president of all Americans, but he never gave an interview to Fox News. How can you be a president of anyone when you won't talk to half of the country for 4 years? He even, and I forgot this, passed on the Super Bowl interview. Now, if there's ever been a softball interview, it's when usually there are some questions asked to Mr. President just before the Super Bowl. And this, without a doubt, is the largest audience any politician might ever be able to garner. And Joe Biden turned it down. Now, he goes on to talk about the fact that you also have all sorts of other situations. He talks, and I never really knew this, talks about AOC when sometimes you see her going down the hallway and being asked a question. It's actually scripted. I did not know all that. And he says it's more scripted than an Aaron Sorkin movie. Aaron Sorkin, by the way, is the one that did The West Wing. But nevertheless, I was unaware of that until I read this piece. And then the fact is there's probably very good evidence that they not only had set it up, but they were feeding the questions to her, coordinating with the staff to get the video of her relevant to the news cycle. And I've often wondered, of course, they talk about that with AOC, what about maybe even Jasmine Crockett and some others that you've always wondered about. But nevertheless, that is part of the issue that is there, in which when other people try to approach her, she just simply walks past them. And so, again, I'll give credit to the fact that, okay, you do see Scott Jennings sometimes on CNN, but that's about it. And there are many people that have been banned from so-called left-wing media. Top of the list, of course, Stephen Miller and some others. And nevertheless, I thought it was just kind of interesting to look at that situation and then to point out that he also is watching right now what's even unfolding in the California governor's race. Our California listeners are well aware of the fact that when I mentioned the name Katie Porter, she is an individual that probably isn't going to be doing as well. But when a while back, you might remember, she was asked what she planned to do to reach out to the 40% of California voters that voted for Trump, instead of giving kind of the standard, well, I'm going to try to make my case before them and hoping some of them will listen to me. She basically just said, why would I need to appeal to them? I can win without them. And again, if you are going to be a senator from the state of California and you have the mindset that unless you voted for me, I don't care who you are, that's going to be a tough sell. But I think it's typical of what we're seeing with more and more of this tribalism. And he says, can you imagine a conservative politician saying people who aren't in lockstep with them, I'm not even going to talk to them? And I really think it's kind of hard. He then gives a story, and for those of you that live in Tennessee, I'm not as familiar with the Democratic Congressman Steve Cohen, but ever since we had kind of the gerrymandering taking place, he decided, I'm not going to run because, after all, I was in a district that was like 70% Democrat. Now it's competitive, and I just don't want to bother. And again, I think you're starting to see this mindset that just simply says, I'm only going to talk to the people I agree with. And the point he makes at the end is Democrats don't make a case for their ideas anymore. They make threats to those who don't get in line and obey them. And if you've been paying attention, you recognize that you've now had the NAACP calling on black athletes and fans to boycott the SEC, which is kind of interesting because they didn't make the decision. The SEC, the Southern Conference, and the Atlantic Coast Conference and some of that, so that it might actually deplete some of the programs, football and basketball. Similar, the NAACP urging fans and athletes to boycott over the question, basically, that came down from the Supreme Court. Same day, we have, of course, now members of the Congressional Black Caucus calling for members to block name, image, and likeness of some of the conferences and to begin to go after the NAACP, NCAA, I should say, first of all, NAACP saying this, and then NCAA. And I just think it's a good illustration again. Instead of saying, here, I want to make our case for why what you're doing is wrong and why we need to do this. Instead, the typical reaction is to boycott, to blackball, to just decide not to engage in the conversation. And it does seem to me at a time when we are seeing midterm elections, it is really unfortunate that more and more of these candidates are simply saying, I'm just going to go to the people that agree with me, even though when I'm elected, I'm supposed to represent everybody, even the people I won't even talk to, which I think is not healthy for the republic. Anyway, Derek Harper really gives us, Derek Hunter gives us a very good perspective on that. And it's just one more illustration of something we're going to come back to a little bit later. But let's take a break. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Psychologist and author Jonathan Haidt has been researching the influences on teenagers and young adults. Several years ago, we interviewed him on his book, The Coddling of the American Mind. More recently, he's been known for his book, The Anxious Generation. He was recently asked on a podcast, who makes better parents, left-wingers or right-wingers? At first, he pointed to data that showed a slight gap where conservatives are a little happier than liberals. He added it isn't clear whether that is due to parenting or some other factor. However, he then pointed to research he did for his book. The gap between left and right becomes a chasm after 2012. As we discussed on previous commentaries, the date 2012 coincides with the mass adoption of the iPhone and social media apps. He says the bottom line is that when kids are rooted in communities, they don't get washed out to sea by the phone-based childhood living in the virtual world. So over and over again, when we look at the left-right or whether we look at religion, what we find is that secular kids and the liberal kids who get washed out to sea get really depressed after 2012. And a much less effect on conservative and religious kids because I think they're more rooted. The conclusion shouldn't be controversial. We know from numerous studies that children do best in a loving home with a father and a mother. They do best when children don't spend lots of time online. They do best when they're rooted in a community and have social interactions, such as we find in church. We talked about the comments by Jonathan Haidt on my radio program and concluded that more and more research is confirming what the Bible has taught for millennia. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
I'd like to get into the whole issue of anti-Semitism. If for no other reason, that's something we've been talking about for some time. We produced a booklet years ago on anti-Semitism. I updated it in 2023 in light of some of the other arguments that were surfacing after Hamas attacked Israel. But whether you look at those historical issues or the more recent ones, I think you can see that we've got another real concern that has surfaced of all places in the New York Times. And that's why I come to Stephen Sokop, who writes from the Protocols of Elders of Zion to the New York Times. Now, first of all, to understand some of that, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was a conspiracy. It was a fabricated text, which was known at the time probably by many people to not be true. But it was an anti-Semitic tract that was first published in Russia, translated in a lot of languages, calling and documenting the supposed conspiracy of the world, the Jewish world against our world. Also, as we go through this, he also mentions this idea of blood libel. What is that? Well, that was one of those that comes primarily, I think, during the Middle Ages, if I remember right, which was the false allegation that Jews were murdering Christian children to use their blood in the baking of unleavened bread during Passover, and that Jews said that they were drinking blood with wine and all this kinds of stuff. And these were these anti-Semitic tropes that existed. And you might say, okay, well, some of this comes from the Middle Ages, some of this comes from maybe something that was at the last century. Why are we talking about it now? Well, it has to do with this particular piece by New York columnist Nicholas Kristof. And just days before, there was this incredible study that we talked about even yesterday. We talked about it on Friday. I don't want to get into it too much because it's pretty gruesome stuff, in which doing hundreds of interviews and looking at thousands of pictures and videos and things like that, the nation of Israel documented for the first time some of the most gruesome aspects of what happened on October 7th. Well, just a few days before, New York columnist Nicholas Kristof published a piece in which it was said that you had Israeli prisoner guards using dogs and other things to torture Palestinians. And you can't help but wonder if that came out at first so that it could provide some kind of, if you will, moral equivalency. As a matter of fact, Jim Dennison yesterday wrote about that. He said, really, if I could write about 3 articles, I would certainly write about Ebola being in Africa, of course, the Rededicate 250, which we talked about yesterday, but also he had decided to write about this because you had the sense that that was the case. Well, Stephen Sokop says, look, I don't really know Nicholas Kristof. I know he at one point wanted to be the governor of Oregon. I don't know if he's anti-Semitic or whether he's just naive about all of this. I don't know if he really believes that dogs can be trained to rape people, and I'm being very careful even of the kind of description that was there. And nevertheless, whether he was a good person who thought he was doing a good thing or whether he was really trying to advance an agenda is sort of irrelevant, because if nothing else, having this particular column come out days before was seeming to be an attempt to try to counter program against the real evidence that had been collected by the nation of Israel about how systemic and how brutal and how sexual some of the attacks were on October 7th. And so he goes into then saying, why is it we still have anti-Semitism? Not that I'm planning on writing another booklet on anti-Semitism, but if I do, this piece here gives you some great material, because first of all, he talks about Hannah Arendt, who wrote the book The Origins of Totalitarianism, in which she talks about where some of this came from because people were upset about the fact that Jewish people had various finances, Jewish financiers. You also, of course, had some anti-Semitism long before that, which is why he points out that as helpful as her piece was, It failed, as he said, to explain how anti-Semitism became so potent and really so justifiable that it could legitimize the murder of 2/3 of all the Jewish people in Europe. And that's where he then goes to Norman Cohn, who wrote the book Warrant for Genocide, in which he talks about the fact that this Jew hatred that was there really required a fantasy of cosmic conspiracy, which gets us now to the protocols of Elders of Zion, because then this idea that the world is in a really bad place according to these anti-Semitic people, because the Jews control all of that. And so this, as he points out, set the stage for the Holocaust and even some of the modern anti-Semitism that we have today. So he says, between those two individuals, we can then kind of arrive at, if you will, a complete explanation for the Holocaust. And this now maybe takes us into where we are, because for centuries, Europeans turned their paranoia and their insecurity on anybody that was an outsider. Jews were one of those targets. He doesn't say here, except just in passing, witches in Salem. You know, you can mention all sorts of other things like that as well. And so he says, let's now come back to Nicholas Kristof, who wrote the other day, which is a textbook example of what he calls the blood libel. Whether he intended it to be or not, his column is a classic application of the fantasy of this cosmic conspiracy. He alleges that sexual violence against Palestinian prisoners is systemic, it's organized, it's state-sanctioned. You know, it's one thing to talk about when individuals go wrong. We've had some examples. For example, I'll use the Vietnam War, a very convenient one, of the massacre of people at My Lai, and the fact that this may be not typical of the American military, but it certainly was of some individuals. But in this particular case, the idea is not that some individuals do it wrong, but this is really a secret rite of initiation of the nation of Israel. And again, he said medieval accusers did not allege that some Jews had killed some Christians, but that this was part of a hidden Jewish council coordinating all of that. And so again, when you have this claim about what these trained dogs were supposedly doing, that this was institutional practice, this is bestiality, animals are an instrument. It just goes on. And I think it's just a reminder that this particular piece just illustrates how quickly there seems to be a willingness to assume that anything a Jewish person does, anything the nation of Israel does, is by definition wrong. And as soon as you get evidence, even if the evidence comes from the Hamas News Bureau, if you will, we're going to run with that. And I think it's just a good illustration of why we will continue to talk about this issue of anti-Semitism. We are convinced that this is a problem on the left. It has become, as we've mentioned sometimes, a problem on the right. And it's a reason for we as Christians to speak out and to support Jewish people, and certainly the right of the nation of Israel to exist. Just before I take a break, though, let me also mention that my commentary today is titled Right-Wing Parents, which, interestingly enough, comes from a very good piece that came out and an interview that was done with Jonathan Haidt. You might say, who is he? Well, I'll hold up his book here, The Coddling of the American Mind, and that is a book that we did an interview with him on. And now more recently, his book, I'll hold this one up as well, The Anxious Generation, which, by the way, illustrates the fact that he certainly would not be considered a Christian by any stretch of the imagination, not even a conservative, but he has done very good work in looking at what is happening to the young people today, and it's a good illustration of that. But in the right-wing parents question, he was asked, well, who makes better parents, left-wingers or right-wingers? At first he says, well, you know, there used to be a little bit of a gap where conservatives maybe were happier than liberals, but we're not sure that's due to parenting. But if you go to after the date 2012, when we had very significant market penetration of the smartphones and social media, the gap is huge. And he makes the case that if nothing else, secular kids and liberal kids sometimes just get washed out to sea. They're more likely to be anxious. They're more likely to be depressed. And so in some cases, the conservative and religious kids actually do better because they're more rooted. If you'd like to see the piece, it's very well done, and it's just a reminder of some of the good work that he's been doing over the years. We're going to be looking for more of his books, but I do commend to you The Coddling of the American Mind and The Anxious Generation as 2 books worth your time to read. We'll be right back.
I'm sure that you've noticed that social media is now filled with information generated by AI. Dramatic descriptions of politicians and music stars supposedly making statements about a current issue, leaning into the microphone, looking into the lens, opponents silenced. It's powerful, it's riveting, and it's all lies. Even several national television networks were recently found using enhanced pictures, meaning manipulated, falsified, literally not giving a true picture. So many liars, so much deception. Where can we turn for truth? Right here. From Kerby and the team at Point of View, we need your support. Please join the Point of View Truth Team today with a monthly gift of $30 or more. Together, we can shine the light of truth and dispel the darkness and deception of this day. Give now at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, I'm going to come to an article that actually I've had some difficulty getting on the air. It was one that I was going to originally discuss on Friday with Dr. Merrill Matthews, but then sometimes the number of articles that we do need to talk about gets a little bit long, so I pulled it off. I put it on yesterday to get to, and maybe if the talk show host wasn't so verbal, and also, of course, if we'd had our guest who from Brazil join us in the first hour instead of the second hour. But we eventually get to this, and the reason I bring it up is simply this. One of the themes that we've tried to add over the last couple of years here at Point of View is to look at emotional health, and I'll hold up our book on a biblical view on emotional health. We've had guests on here to talk about this, and that I think is very important because in some respects we have noticed since the pandemic, some of the mental and emotional problems have increased dramatically. And I think that is due in large part to environmental issues. It's also due to a redefinition of what mental health might be. And so for just a minute, I thought I would get into this. And then in some respects, it's good that I waited because interestingly enough, our next article comes from a new book by Jonathan Alpert called Therapy Nation, in which as an individual who is a therapist is criticizing fellow therapists. And in some respects, a lot of this goes back to the coddling of the American mind, which we just talked about, and even the anxious generation. But let me get into it because Adam Omery says Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. announced an initiative last week to reduce the overprescribing of psychiatric medications, especially among children. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reports that autism now appears in 1 in 31 children, a 381% increase since 2000. Okay, first of all, let me issue all the disclaimers. Disclaimer number one, I'm not, as we go through this, arguing that we should never actually give people psychiatric medicine. We have had all sorts of people. Sheila Walsh, when she's been on this program many times, has talked about, I just took my pill, her way of saying this has been very important in her growth. I have people in the extended family, at least 2 individuals, who are in very good shape because of psychiatric medicine. But even the people that take those pills will admit we probably oversubscribe those. We probably overprescribe those. We probably give them to entirely too many people. The question of ADHD, the question of autism. In some respects, people are saying, well, maybe it's simply because we now have ignored, we have actually acknowledged things that we've ignored. Does that make sense? Of course it does. And so, first of all, recognize as we get into this, there's something else. Because Adam Omary says that much of the surge in mental illness can be explained. Are you ready for this? And I did not know this until his documented material on this. The American Psychiatric Association's diagnostic criteria in recent decades has actually made it more likely that you would diagnose somebody who has anxiety. As we all know, there are times when any one of us are anxious, but are we so anxious that we now have to reach for a pill or some kind of medication? And that, first of all, has made it easier to diagnose those things. But there's also, and as Marlon Maddox, the host of Point of View, the founder of Point of View, used to say so many times, you've heard it many times, follow the money. There's a financial incentive. How so? Turns out that the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act of 2008, extended by the Affordable Care Act of 2010, required health plans to cover mental health services at parity with medical and surgical care. That, first of all, obviously did address an inequity, but it also meant something which I don't think was necessarily always an unintended consequence, because clinicians now are paid more when they diagnose more cases. And if you think that that doesn't have an influence, well, I think you have to understand human behavior. The result is what economists call a supplier-induced demand. Now, when we have more supplies, we have more psychiatric drugs, and we can actually diagnose them more often, and they can get coverage. What's the implication? That is certainly the case. Now, again, to be fair, defenders of mental health parity in this article argue that spending and diagnosis are rising to meet previously unmet needs. But as, again, the author points out, psychiatry is probably the most subjective of all the branches of medicine. I've had psychiatrists on this program. I've done interviews on programs that were run by psychiatrists, and they will tell you that. So they understand that only so well. And when the National Institute of Mental Health says that half of all American adolescents have experienced mental illness, either you've got to say, we are a really sick country, or maybe is it possible that psychiatry is advancing as a field and maybe even pathologizing ordinary struggle? And so as a result, just take this pill and everything will be fine. I might point you to my commentary that I did on Friday, which has the title George Orwell and Aldous Huxley, because if you remember, in Brave New World and Huxley, you take this little pill and it makes you have happiness. And so that is certainly the case. So anyway, Adam Omary goes on to say, wasteful spending and panic over a possibly non-existent mental health crisis would be bad enough, but psychiatric overdiagnosis creates an even more serious problem over medication. So I was going to talk with Dr. Matthews because he's the expert on kind of healthcare abuse and fraud, but there's only part of that. we're spending money to diagnose and treat people that maybe shouldn't be treated in the first place, but more importantly, we're over prescribing these drugs as well. And he says the reimbursement architecture makes over-medication practically inevitable. Once a patient is on a drug, the side effects are often addressed with a second drug rather than with a reassessment of the first. Clinicians call this prescribing cascade. An antidepressant causes insomnia, so a sleep aid is added. A stimulant causes irritability, so a mood stabilizer follows. I learned this at a very young age when one time my father, who knew a lot about psychiatric medicines and had really dealt a lot with pharmacy, was looking at his brother, my uncle, who, as they were starting to sort out all the drugs he was taking, concluded this whole idea of a prescribing cascade. You took the drug from this one doctor, and then you had negative implications, contraindications, side effects. So this other doctor prescribed you for the side effects, and then that created some side effects, and so another doctor prescribed you, or the original doctor prescribed it, and pretty soon you'd be better if you didn't take any of the drugs at all, or just went back to taking the one drug and lived with the side effects. And that, I think, is something we've all seen before. So, of course, you have right now the new initiative from the Department of Health and Human Services. This, of course, would be Health and Human Service Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. writing a Dear Colleague letter, which is a sensible step, he says, but it won't address the root problem. The fundamental problem is we have a federal law that actually has created an incentive structure that makes psychiatric medication the default for tens of millions of Americans who might be better served by therapy or lifestyle intervention, or in some cases, no clinical intervention at all. In just a minute, I'm going to take the other part of that equation, and that is to say that sometimes the therapy itself is also a problem, but it's an illustration of something that I am going to start paying attention to. When on this program, and even through Jonathan Haidt, through The Anxious Generation, his book, points out that the number of people showing depression, anxiety, suicide ideation just rising significantly, is it possible that some of that has to do with the broadening of the diagnostic and the diagnostic criteria of the American Psychiatric Association? I think anybody with an open mind might say, yeah, that might account for some of that increase, and that's something to pay attention to. So I give you this article. It appeared in the Wall Street Journal. It documents some of this. Again, we recognize the value of psychiatric medication, but has some of that been overprescribed? I think that's pretty obvious. Let's take a break. We'll talk about the therapy part of this equation right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let's see if we can talk about therapy. And again, the same disclaimer. We understand that there is a value to psychiatric medication, although I think it's overprescribed. There's certainly a value to therapy or counseling. I would have to say biblically based counseling. But I think it is really striking that Jonathan Alpert, who is a psychotherapist, has a book that is entitled Therapy Nation: How America Got Hooked on Therapy and Why It's Left Us More Anxious and Divided. Now, I haven't read the book for a very good reason. The book comes out today. The publication date is May 19th. If you look at your calendar, it's May 19th. So as I go into a bookstore, I might think about buying it, although this isn't necessarily something we talk about so often. But what he has done is actually posted a summary, if you will, of his book. And if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to read about it, even if I don't read the book, this 2-page summary is really pretty good. And so this one is entitled, Is Therapy Tearing Us Apart? And as I read through this, it reminds me of some of the conversation we had with Jonathan Haidt about the closing of the American mind. And it reminds me of some of the things in his book, The Anxious Generation. Reminds us of some of the conversation we even had as we talked about this booklet on emotional health, where we spent some time talking with Chris Thurman about this. We've talked with Henry Cloud. Of course, we had June Hunt on, Dan Allender. We've had a number of Christians address this. But as far as I can tell, Jonathan Alpert is not a Christian, or certainly if he is, he hasn't made a point about that. But he's saying the kinds of things we would have probably said and had some concerns. Because he talks about a patient that came in to see him, furious with a friend, and furious about what would just be a disappointment, and canceled dinner date, and then a text that was returned too late. And this individual, and I'm pretty sure it says she, so this woman says that my friend is toxic, the exchange has become a violation of boundaries, and the hurt has now elevated into trauma. Now, again, somebody misses a dinner date, okay, that's a faux pas. I'm not sure that I'm going to end a relationship over that, but the point is she had screenshots. She had a whole story that revealed her friend's pathology. What he says she didn't have was any introspection. Could this have been carelessness rather than ill intent? Was the reaction intensified by other things that might have been going on? Had she contributed in any way to the conflict? The language he says she brought into the room gave her something powerful. Certainty. But certainty isn't often the enemy of insight. And it reminds me, we've talked before about the kind of toxic ideas, what we call negative interpretation, where you say something that could even be seen positively or negatively, you always interpret it in the most negative light. And he says in my forthcoming book, of course it just came out today, he says too much of modern therapy culture keeps people stuck, reinforcing grievance, externalizing blame, and turning everyone else into a reason their lives are so miserable. In other words, everybody else is the problem, not me. He says, for years, my profession has trained clinicians to elevate validation over challenge, affirmation over interpretation, emotional fluency over the hard work of behavioral change. What has followed is the rise of grievance culture dressed up as psychological sophistication. We see that in these books that have come out. We see this in all sorts of articles. We see it in social media all the time. And so he goes on to say, of course it is your boss's fault. Of course your colleague is toxic. Of course your ex is a narcissist. Of course the world is wounding you. He says every difficult interaction at work has been interpreted through the same frame. The boss is toxic, the coworkers are invalidating, and the environment unsafe. Too much, he says, of modern therapy culture keeps people stuck, reinforcing grievance, externalizing any kind of blame. He then goes on to say this is how therapy can quietly become an engine that keeps people stuck. People leave not more capable of tolerating frustration, ambiguity, or ordinary disappointment, but less. Well, it may feel like growth. It functions as avoidance. That is corrosive. The patient becomes good at explanation, more sophisticated in the language of harm, and more certain about who is to blame, but no closer to actual change. Grievance becomes part of identity. What do? They separate. Oh, I think that was the conversation we just had a few minutes ago about politicians deciding no longer to even go to some of their constituency because we're just going to write them off. And all sorts of people getting more and more in their silos, more and more in their tribes. And he says the same emotional habit doesn't stay confined to the therapy office. People carry it into marriages. They carry it into friendships. They carry it into workplaces, and eventually they carry it into, you knew it, politics. Ordinary frustration becomes proof of mistreatment. Ambivalence becomes danger. Disagreement becomes evidence of harm. Once enough people are trained to interpret discomfort this way, coexisting with others starts to feel impossible. I have to stay with my tribe. Political consequences follow naturally. A citizen trained to experience ordinary conflict as evidence of harm will eventually bring the same mindset into public life. On national television, he says, prominent therapists and psychiatrists suggest it might be essential to your mental health to avoid anybody who supports Trump during the holidays. We don't want any of those Trump voting relatives around the table, so you probably should just avoid them. The same therapeutic scripts that encourage patients to pathologize difficult bosses and disappointing partners now teach citizens to reinterpret ordinary democratic indifferences or differences as evidence of danger, right? And he says, again, finally, the algorithm doesn't elevate the more psychologically accurate interpretation. It elevates the most emotionally satisfying one. Hence, the ecosystem of so-called mental health influencers, endless posts, diagnose narcissists, decode toxic bosses, turn ordinary disappointment into proof of pathology. Social media rewards certainty, speed, and self-protection. Precisely the instincts real therapy is supposed to challenge before turning them into conclusions. The result isn't more psychologically sophisticated society. In many cases, it is just the opposite. He says, my own field should be willing to say this plainly. We helped create this culture. Real therapy should make people more capable of dealing with reality, not less. Very good piece. Preview, of course, of the book. But is therapy tearing us apart? The connection between my first article about what's happening in the political realm and my last article, which talks about what's happening as you are getting therapy, maybe connect together in ways most people wouldn't have seen until now. Takes the time to read some of these. We've posted them for you to read, and they're available on the website. And most importantly, just before I run out of time, let me mention tomorrow we're going to talk about our third very significant book about archaeology. Dr. Paul Weaver will be in studio with us. I think you will once again be encouraged that we have so much more evidence for our faith than we had even just a few decades ago, certainly centuries ago. And I think this will be an encouragement to you here on Point of View. Just before I say goodbye, let me mention again that I always appreciate what Megan does behind the scene, engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. And if you find yourself saying, I need to read some of these materials, we have them available at the website, pointofview.net. Just click on that button that says See More, and I think you will be enlightened by some of the articles we've posted for you to read today. See you back here tomorrow on Point of View.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.